Gwen Stacy is one of the most influential comic book characters to have ever existed for Marvel Comics. Her character has been the centre of a lot of controversy throughout the years, and a lot of hidden lore that not a lot of fans know about. Today we're going to be diving deep into this character, exploring the very basics of where she came from and what she's famous for, to some of the theories and speculation that surround the character and shroud it in mystery and darkness. So with that, here is the Gwen Stacy Iceberg. In the Amazing Spider-Man issue 121, written by Jerry Conway and penciled by John Romita Sr., Gwen Stacy tragically lost her life. The story goes that Spider-Man and the Green Goblin are at the centre of their feud. The Green Goblin up until this point learned the true identity of Spider-Man being Peter Parker, and he thought the best way to hurt Peter Parker would be to kidnap and kill his girlfriend at the time, Gwen Stacy. The Green Goblin ends up pushing her off the George Washington Bridge, and Peter, in an attempt to save her, ends up snapping her neck by grabbing her with a web line, which stops her with sudden force. Her death is considered one of the most pivotal, if not the most pivotal death in comic book history, right up there alongside the other Spider-Man death, which is also very iconic, which is of course Uncle Ben. Up until this point, the mantra of no one stays dead in comic books was very much adopted by most large comic book companies. However, Gwen was one of the first deaths to really undo this and go against the meta, making her death one of the most pivotal deaths in comic book history. The introduction of Spider-Gwen. In 2014, the Edge of the Spider-Verse issue number 2 introduces to a brand new version of the Gwen Stacy character, of course, Spider-Gwen. It took a few years for this character to really get off the ground, but once she got going, arguably now Spider-Gwen is way more popular than Gwen Stacy ever was, especially with new audiences of Spider-Man. Spider-Gwen became that popular that she ended up receiving her own title comic book under Marvel Comics on Earth 65. The Spider-Verse films. Voiced by Haley Steinfeld, Gwen Stacy has been popularized to the masses through Spider-Gwen in the Spider-Verse films. And arguably, if it wasn't for the Spider-Verse films at this current modern day and age, Gwen Stacy wouldn't actually be as popular as she is today. The Spider-Verse films, controversially, have also probably made Spider-Gwen more popular than the original version of Gwen Stacy, as I mentioned before. But with the fans seeming to love her, it looks like this version of the character is going to be forever here to stay. The First Love. Even though Peter Parker has actually had more than one girlfriend before Gwen Stacy came along in the comic books, most notably Betty Brant probably being the most famous one, Gwen Stacy is known to most comic book fans as Peter Parker's first true love. And this is also one of the reasons, apart from her death, as to why she is such a popular character with not just the casual fans but with comic book fans alike. It's because Peter and Gwen were the item in the 60s and the 70s. They were the couple that a lot of people looked up to in the comic book fandom, even before Mary Jane came along to date Peter later on in the series. Ultimate Gwen. Ultimate Gwen is of course from the original Ultimate Universe back in the early 2000s, written and created by Brian Michael Bendis. Ultimate Gwen is a lot different from her 616 counterpart, and actually arguably is more similar to her Spider-Gwen version of the character that would appear a lot later down the line. Gwen here is reimagined as a teen with short hair and a nasty attitude. She has a strong will, but actually doesn't have any romantic involvement with Peter at all. In this version of events, Gwen actually ends up merging with the Venom symbiote and ultimately ends up dying. However, as we'll discuss later on in this Iceberg video, Gwen does actually come back as a clone in the Ultimate Universe. Ghost Spider. Ghost Spider is a highly controversial renaming of the character of Spider-Gwen. The name Spider-Gwen in general has resonated with so many fans across the board ever since she was introduced in 2014. And since of course the Spider-Verse movies have popularized that version of the character, Spider-Gwen is now a household name. However, Marvel have tried to rebrand her several times, launching Ghost Spider as her official name. However, no matter how many titles and how many new number ones and how many printed panels with Ghost Spider that Marvel have on them, the fans never seem to recognize Spider-Gwen as Ghost Spider. The reason for this change is that the name Spider-Gwen creates a lot of problems continuity-wise, as of course if her first real government name was in her superhero name, that would create an identity identity conflict. And I think Marvel just wanted to make it a little bit easier for the writers when she's not called Spider-Gwen. A lot of people would argue why not just call her Spider-Woman like she is in the Spider-Verse films, but I think Marvel wanted her to have her own unique brand. However, like I mentioned, this name has not caught on, and the fans just simply refuse to refer to her as Ghost Spider, as to this day, she is still widely known as Spider-Gwen. Gwenom. A fan favourite arc from the Spider-Gwen comics is actually when Gwen attaches to the Venom symbiote. This arc is considered one of the best arcs for the character thus far. It ends up dealing with a darker, edgier version of Gwen Stacy who has to grapple with her own rage. Across the board, most people love this arc, and if you are looking to get into Gwen Stacy comic books, I mentioned it here because I believe if you want to start reading them, this is a good one to get into as well. Sins Past. This is by far and arguably Gwen Stacy's most controversial comic book that she's ever been a part of. Sins Past is a story written in the early 2000s where it was revealed that Gwen Stacy actually had an affair with Norman Osborn before her death, and she actually got pregnant with twins, Gabrielle and Sarah. Even though the story was generally well written, the consensus of the story overall, fans just disagreed with. Gwen having cheated on Peter Parker, who a lot of people considered to be her one true love, didn't sit right with a lot of people. Famously, this story was actually retconned later on in Nick Spencer's 2018 run on the Amazing Spider-Man comic books, and Gwen never actually ended up having an affair with Norman Osborn, and her twins weren't actually her children. The 90s animated show. One of the weirdest disinclusionments of Gwen Stacy's character in a Spider-Man show that was heavily popular was the 90s animated show. Not appearing until the very last season on a completely different world to the original Earth that this version of Spider-Man was from, Gwen Stacy just ceased to appear in the entire show. In fact, a lot of the storylines that surrounded Gwen Stacy in the comic books that were actually adapted into the Spider-Man show from the 90s were subsequently replaced by Mary Jane in Gwen Stacy's position. Most famously, the Death of storyline that included Mary Jane in the 90s show is directly adapted from the Death of Gwen Stacy storyline from the comic books. But of course, Mary Jane took the place of Gwen in this specific instance. The main reason for her disinclusionment in the show is that showrunner John Semper actually wanted to avoid the tragic death of Gwen Stacy as a storyline in the show. Another reason for her disinclusionment is because of the popularity of Felicia Hardy, aka Black Cat. Earlier on in the show's run, around season 1 and 2, Semper also believed that because Black Cat, aka Felicia Hardy, was more popular at the time during the 90s, that Black Cat would be a better fit for the show due to popularity to fill in some of Gwen's roles as well. Editorial Control. According to writer Jerry Conway, Gwen's death was actually more controversial than it actually originally seemed. Even though it seems like a fantastic decision to kill Gwen off now in hindsight because of the impact that it had on Peter's character and the stories that followed, apparently getting her to die in those comic books wasn't as easy as it first seemed. Gwen's death wasn't actually driven by the story in place at all. In fact, Gwen's death was driven primarily by editorial. The reason they did this is because they wanted to shake up the status quo for Peter Parker. They also thought Gwen Stacy was too perfect for Peter and listed her as a character that didn't really have many places to go in the future of their stories. A lot of the execs believed that Gwen was holding Peter's character back, and the best thing that she could do was ultimately kick the bucket and die. Despite her death having a positive impact on the characters and the story, her death was far more controversial than a lot of people even seem to realize. Gwenpool. A massive misconception in this day and age is actually the character of Gwenpool. Now, a lot of people see the name Gwenpool and think it's an amalgamation of Gwen Stacy, aka Spider-Gwen, and of course the very popular character Deadpool. But that actually isn't the case. Even though it started off as a parody of the two characters, this character actually has nothing to do with Gwen Stacy in the current comic books. The character's actual name is quite literally Gwenpool. And that character is not Gwen Stacy, it's not even Wade Wilson, it is a completely different character that a lot of people don't even seem to realise isn't actually Gwen Stacy. The Clone Saga. A lot of people know about the Clone Saga, and if this was a iceberg dictated to just Spider-Man stories, the Clone Saga is right there up on the top. Everyone knows about the Clone Saga, but what a lot of people don't know about the Clone Saga is Gwen Stacy's involvement in the Clone Saga. A lot of people remember this story for Ben Reilly and the cloning of Peter Parker. However, the main antagonist of the story, Miles Warren, aka the Jackal, also had a unnerving fascination for the character of Gwen Stacy. Alongside Peter Parker being cloned, Gwen actually gets cloned as well. And after returning into Peter's life momentarily, Peter realizes that this version of Gwen Stacy isn't the original and is actually a clone. Joyce Delaney lived for many years in the 616 universe, residing in London, until her eventual death in the Spider Island series a few years back. Another tragic end for a Gwen Stacy character. Original plan for Gwen Stacy. Early concepts of the death of Gwen Stacy storyline actually attributed the death of Gwen Stacy to not Gwen at all, but rather Mary Jane Watson. That's right, yes, Mary Jane and even Aunt May were considered for the death before Gwen Stacy, to shake up the status quo. As I mentioned earlier, Gwen's death felt like it would have more impact on the overall story, thus Gwen was chosen to die in that specific storyline. House of M Gwen Stacy. In the alternate Marvel reality House of M, this gives us a glimpse into what Peter and Gwen's life could have been like if it all turned out okay and if she didn't actually die. Peter and Gwen are happily married and they actually have a son. It's a bittersweet glimpse for the fans as to what could have been between Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy. The Gwen Effect. This term has circled around the comic book community for a while now. The Gwen Effect, as it's being dubbed, is a term that refers to the effect where female characters are killed off to serve male superhero characters. Gwen's death became a major template for what fridging is now called in the comic book community, where characters essentially are killed off to motivate male superheroes. Gwen's death was actually a major factor in this new movement against fridging female characters, as her death was a classic example of what fridging a female character is. Gwen literally dies for the purpose of Peter Parker's character, which is where a part of this term fridging comes from. Even though Gwen Stacy's death never actually initiated the whole fridging debate in the first place, that title goes to the Green Lantern comic books, Gwen Stacy's death was ultimately a massive motivator in the discussions of what fridging a female character can look like. And ultimately this has been a massive debate on the internet and between comic book fans and in the community ever since her death happened. Clone Conspiracy 2016. So even if you do know about the Clone Saga, and even if you know about how Miles Warren ended up cloning Gwen as well as Peter, you might not know about the recent Clone Saga story from 2016, the Clone Conspiracy. The way this story goes is essentially Miles Warren, aka the Jackal, does end up returning and ends up cloning Gwen once more. However, this time, Gwen retains all of her memories, essentially making her the original version of Gwen Stacy. However, this version of Gwen doesn't feel right. She doesn't feel like she fits into this version of society, and a lot of time has passed since her death. In a dark twist of events, she ends up choosing to die on her own behalf because she feels like she doesn't fit in, which is another tragic end to another version of the Gwen Stacy character. What if Gwen Stacy had lived? Marvel actually published a what if comic book surrounding the idea of what if Gwen Stacy had actually lived. Now, unlike the House of M story where Peter and Gwen were married, this version of the story actually ends worse than if Peter Parker died. Gwen's survival in this version of the story actually ends up leading to Aunt May's death and Peter's identity as Spider-Man getting leaked to the entire world, which ultimately is a worse end to this version of the story and a more tragic and dark end than if Gwen Stacy had actually died. A lot of fans believe this is actually a meta commentary on what would have happened if Gwen Stacy didn't die, and actually believe that this proves, because Marvel wrote this comic book themselves, that Peter Parker losing Gwen Stacy in any universe is an inevitability and must happen for the sacrifice of the character. The Snap Theory. One of the most debated comic book panels in the history of comics overall is the one where Gwen Stacy sadly loses her life. The caption "Snap" is seen next to her neck when Peter grabs her with his web line. Now, many fans believe for a very long time that this is because the force and the whiplash of the sudden stop actually causes her neck to snap. However, many fans, especially recently, have speculated that she never actually died from the neck snap at all. The new theory is that Gwen Stacy actually died due to the shock of the fall, and no matter what Peter did, even if he managed to save her without snapping her neck, Gwen was ultimately dead either way. Which is actually a scary and slightly ominous thought when you reread the book with that context in mind. Spider-Gwen's meta critique. Some critics actually view Spider-Gwen's initial introduction as a character as almost an apology of what happened to the original version of Gwen Stacy. A lot of people believe that Spider-Gwen wasn't created by Marvel because she's a cool character and you could tell some really good stories with her. Some people actually believe that Spider-Gwen was created as a way of apologizing for the mistake they made with Gwen Stacy. These critics believe that Spider-Gwen is a way of Marvel rewriting their mistake that they made in the 70s. And of course, this all links back to the idea of Gwen Stacy being fridged. A lot of people believe that Marvel did wrong by servicing Peter Parker's character by killing Gwen Stacy. There was no other narrative aspect or even an aspect of Gwen's character that fueled her death other than the motive for Peter Parker. This fueled Spider-Gwen's creation. In fact, this was the underlying reason behind her creation in the first place. So instead of letting her stay dead, they gave her a new life. They gave her a new purpose. So the character of Gwen Stacy wouldn't forever be locked up in this fridging scandal. They gave Gwen spider powers so she could become her own character. She could have her own purpose that isn't tied down or defined by Peter Parker. Reincarnation Theory. Reincarnation Theory is a very mysterious and ominous theory that a lot of fans have regarding Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy. If you guys remember back to Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, a massive theme with the character of Gwen Stacy is that she struggles to run from the inevitability that one day she may end up dying, because in every universe that version of Gwen had been to, she had seen Gwen Stacy ultimately lose her life because of Peter Parker. This theory suggests that across the Marvel multiverse, Gwen Stacy and Peter Parker are always destined to meet. Meaning that it doesn't matter what happens to Peter Parker in one universe, it doesn't matter what happens to Gwen Stacy in another, one version or another will ultimately end up meeting and falling in love. And that is ultimately the end game. This theory suggests that Mary Jane Watson isn't actually the end game for Peter Parker, but it is actually Gwen Stacy. Whether it's Spider-Gwen, whether it's Gwen herself, or whether it's an entirely different version of Gwen altogether. This theory is now fueled by the fact that Gwen Stacy from Earth 65 is now a permanent resident in the 616 universe. And a lot of fans have speculated the reason for this is that this relationship between Peter and Gwen always seems to be reincarnated. Whenever Marvel get the opportunity, they end up including Gwen Stacy in their stories. We've only got to look back to 2016 to see the last time Gwen was actually cloned. And we've only actually got to look back a few years ago when they actually used Gwen Stacy in the Judgment Day storyline to fuel Peter's character there once again. It seems like Peter can't actually get a rest of Gwen Stacy, and no matter what happens in these comic books, no matter how much they try to push Peter and Mary Jane, or Peter and another love interest, Peter always ends up coming back with Gwen Stacy one way or another. It's like they are connected through and through, and no matter what happens, Marvel is always going to try and lean back to pushing those two characters together. And a lot of fans believe that Gwen's interaction with the 616 universe and now her permanent resident in that universe is eventually going to lead to some sort of relationship between that version of Gwen and our version, the 616 version of Peter Parker. It's quite an ominous thought when you really think about it. Marvel is sort of pressing from the outsides on all of these different characters. The Lost miniseries. The Lost miniseries is actually a series dedicated to Gwen Stacy before her death. However, the series never got off the ground in Marvel publication. This prequel series would follow Gwen through her college years and was actually aimed to deepen her character far more than the original Amazing Spider-Man books managed to do. Once again, this ties back to the whole fridging thing and the Gwen effect. Because Gwen was such a shallow character and because she was deemed too perfect, this series was ultimately designed to come along and actually deepen her character, in a similar way to what Spider-Man Blue attempted to do with Gwen and Peter as well. However, reportedly this series was actually cancelled to avoid complicating her legacy. As if Marvel doesn't already do enough of that. But either way, this series was cancelled and never ended up going ahead. And forever it remains a rumour of what could have been for the character of Gwen Stacy before her ultimate death. TASM 3 Resurection. After the Amazing Spider-Man 2 ended up killing Gwen Stacy off, it was actually rumoured that Gwen Stacy was going to return in the Amazing Spider-Man 3, which ended up getting cancelled. Although just rumours and speculation, we do know that the Amazing Spider-Man 3 was going to delve into the idea of cloning, with Dennis Leary, the actor who plays George Stacy in the Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, revealing that actually he was meant to come back for the third film, as there were ideas that apparently he was going to be cloned in that movie. So of course speculation arose. Did this mean that Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man was going to try and clone Gwen Stacy? Did this mean they were going to do some kind of mad storyline with Emma Stone coming back into the movie? Does this mean Spider-Gwen was going to appear? There was all different types of rumours going on. But yes, if the cloning thing actually happened, Gwen Stacy was set to return in The Amazing Spider-Man 3. And that is it for the Gwen Stacy Iceberg. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this iceberg video. I've never made one of these before, so let me know if you want me to do a deep dive on another character, going through popular storylines and some theories and fan fiction and some mysterious and possibly anonymous editorial and backlogged stories that I can find just scattered across the internet. I want to know your thoughts. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Take care and peace.